Today I'm brewing an Indian Pale Ale with spicy and peppery notes. It's a Rye IPA. We're also going to take a look at recipe design and how I come up with my recipes. And speaking of which, today's recipe has a little bit more research behind it than usual. Let's get to it.
I got a feeling that this could be a little more than feelings.
Hello, my name is Martin Keane and I am taking the Homebrew Challenge to brew 99 beers in 99 weeks. And I'm currently in category 21B, which is IPAs. And today I'm brewing up a Rye IPA.
Trying to find out more about you.
Now, I've used some rye malts before in some of my recipes, but I've never gone so far as brewing anything that would be considered a rye beer. So when I was putting together this Rye IPA recipe, I was looking for a bit of help, and Matthew from Mean Brews has certainly delivered the goods. But more on that in a moment. Let's first of all get this beer started. I'm going to mash today at 153 Fahrenheit, that's 67 Celsius, about 60 minutes as usual. Let's add it in. For my water chemistry, I have already added some gypsum, calcium chloride and Epsom salt. I'm going for a sulfite to chloride ratio of 3:1. So I'm brewing a 2.5 gallon batch, and in here is 1 gram of Epsom salt, 1 gram of calcium chloride, and 2.5 grams of gypsum. Recirculating the wort. Now let's talk a little bit about recipe design. Now, most of the beers on this channel are my own personal recipes. And that does beg the question, how am I coming up with these things? And it's really quite simple. I'm basically doing some research about the style in general, and then picking ingredients that fit that style, that are ingredients that either I know that I'd like in a particular beer style, or maybe they're ones that I haven't really tried in that beer style before, and I'm kind of curious as to how they'll work out. So here's the general process I go through when I'm building a beer recipe. And I think now is a good reminder that most of my recipes are on AtlanticBrewSupply.com. You can buy these things as kits in all grain or extract versions. So let's talk about the research aspect of this first. How do I figure out what a style really consists of, what I should be shooting for? Well, my first option is to check out the 2015 Bjcp Guidelines. These are the guidelines that I'm following through for my 99 beers, and they describe a series of things about how the beer tastes, its mouthfeel, aroma, appearance, and so forth. So this is really the starting point. But there are a number of websites I quite like as well. Kegerator.com is fantastic. They have each one of the Bjcp styles on here with a description, normally a history, and some information about how to brew it as well, and often some advice on the ingredients that you should add. Another resource that I love is Craft Beer and Brewing magazine. Josh Weikert has a description of every one of the styles that I'm brewing as well. He sometimes goes a little bit beyond the sort of the basics of the style and will add some different ingredients that maybe aren't traditional, so it's kind of interesting to get his take, and I always read up on one of his articles to see what he's doing. And of course, looking at other people's homebrew recipes are a great place to start as well. I particularly like the American Homebrewers Association, of which I'm a member. They have a ton of good recipes. These are typically all award-winning beers, so it's really interesting to click on one of these and then see what it was that they used in their beers as well. Then when I've done that research, I will start to think about what I want to add into my beer, and to actually build the recipe, well, that's where I use Beersmith. So here is my Beersmith recipe for Rye IPA, and in here you can see the water salts that I'm adding in, the malt bill, the hops, and it will also show me down here in the style guide comparison how I'm doing compared to the style itself. But when it came to this specific beer, I had a little bit more help as well, courtesy of Mean Brews.
On today's episode of Mean Brews, we're going to cover Rye IPA.
And what Matthew is doing here is looking at award-winning beers to see what sort of characteristics and ingredients that they had, and then to draw some comparisons between them to show things like the evolution over time of how a style has changed, and also to try to get a consensus on what these award-winning beers have in common. And we can see things like the malt bill, including the amount of crystal malts and the type of crystal malts used. Matthew also illustrates how trends change over time and how more flaked rye is being added to rye IPAs over time. Now, I would highly recommend you check out Matthew's channel, and in particular his Rye IPA video. But what this all boils down to is kind of a recommended recipe based upon the averages that all of these award-winning recipes are made from. So we can really understand, if we want to get something that is going to be similar to the best of the beer style, what we should do. And this recipe is exactly the recipe that I am replicating today. So let's go talk about that. So this beer is going to have an original gravity of about 1066, so around a 6 or 7% ABV beer. Now, the main base malt in this beer is 2-row pale malt at 73%. So unlike, say, a wheat beer where maybe half of the grist is actually wheat malt, a rye beer is still mainly barley. Now, in terms of rye, what we're going to add is 8% of Rye Malt and 8% of Flaked Rye. And then for the toasty malts, going to be adding in 5% of Caramel 60, 4% of Carafoam, and 2% of Victory Malt. Now, this beer is going to have an IBU around 64, 65. That seemed to be about the average for these award-winning beers. In terms of bittering hop, there wasn't really a consensus, just something with fairly high alpha acids. I am going to follow the Mean Brew recommendation, and I'm going to use Mosaic. This will go in at the start of the boil to give the majority of my IBUs. Then with 15 minutes to go, that is when I'm going to add Simcoe. Simcoe then, yeah, that's going in 15 minutes from the end of boil, and then 5 minutes from the end of boil, the last kettle hop that I'm going to add is a bit more Mosaic. Now, every one of the Rye IPAs that Mean Brews looked at included a dry hop addition, and I'll be doing that as well. Specifically, I'm going to be adding in Mosaic and Citra. And because I'm using an SS Brewtech brew bucket, there is the potential that when I add dry hops into my beer, that could end up clogging up the system. So to alleviate that issue, I am using a hop sleeve. It's simply a case of sanitizing this, putting my hops in here, and then I'm going to drop this into the fermenter just before fermentation is complete. That way, any oxygen that I may have introduced by opening up my bucket should be consumed by the yeast and minimize the impact. So yeah, hop sleeve is really the way to go if you are adding dry hops into a fermenter that has the potential to clog. Going to ferment this beer at 63 Fahrenheit or 17 Celsius, and then once fermentation really starts to warm up a bit and get going, I'll raise it all the way up to 68 Fahrenheit or 20 Celsius. Now the consensus on yeast was the Chico strain. I'm using the White Labs version of that, so that's California Ale yeast, WLP001. My wort is not quite at 63 degrees yet. My groundwater was a little bit too warm for that, so as usual I'm going to pop this into my chest freezer, and I'm going to keep an eye on the fermentation, not just for the temperature, but also, of course, because I do need to add that dry hop addition in. And when I'm just a few points from my expected final gravity, that's when I'm going to open this up and put my dry hops in.
Has ever had a rye IPA before?
I don't think I have. I've had a rye whiskey.
Yeah.
Wasn't the biggest fan, but I'm curious what this is going to taste like.
Well, I think already just on looks alone, this looks fantastic.
It does look pretty nice. It's quite bubbly, and it has a really pretty like golden hue to it.
Yeah, golden body and then that beautiful white head on the top.
Yeah.
Looks like a beer I'd want to drink.
Yes.
Now for aroma,
It smells quite inviting.
doesn't it?
Yeah. It smells kind of fruity.
Yeah.
Very hoppy.
Yep. Very much the fruity hops coming through on this one.
Not what I would imagine with, like, I assume a rye beer. So, I don't know. I'm curious.
What do you imagine a rye beer?
Not smelling very nice.
Okay, well it looks good. It smells good.
Yeah.
So it tastes like. Well, I'm getting a lot of those fruity hops in the
Yeah.
taste too.
Very fruity, very hoppy, very good.
Yeah, so the rye might add just a touch of spiciness or something like that to the beer, and I think if it's there, it's not overpowering. I have to say, I have had a bunch of rye beers, and I'm not the biggest fan of rye beers generally.
I don't even like rye bread, so.
Yeah, so I think a sort of subtle rye to this
Yeah.
is probably makes it quite enjoyable.
Man, I like really enjoy this. It's such a good rye PA.
A rye PA.
Rye
It's
PA.
a ripe. It's a ripe old rye PA.
Rye PA, kind of corny. Is it corny? Is there corn in here?
There's no corn in my rye PA. Thank you very much.
Oh.
Absolutely not.
Whatever.
Thank you again to Mean Brews for this fantastic recipe. We both love it. And we are continuing on for just a little bit longer in the category of IPA next week. All right, cheers.
Cheers!